Hi, everyone. My name is Sean Cotter. I'm the executive director for Wicked Queer, Boston's LGBTQ plus film festival. And I have the delight to sit down with Mari Walker from See You Then. And I'm really excited to, one, have this film kind of hot off South by Southwest screening and to share it with the Boston audience. So, Mari, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. I'm still waking up, still getting like those like little neurons firing upstairs, but I'm doing great.
Yeah, because this is kind of early for you on the West Coast, and I completely appreciate you sort of taking the time to sort of sit down with
Oh,
us.
of
Um,
course, so happy to.
yeah, so let's talk about your film. One, I absolutely when I first saw this, Jeffrey Winter, who is from the Film Collaborative, kind of snuck a screener towards to us, as he does, and when I sat with it, I was just like, I was really kind of blown away by it because one of the
Oh,
things that I
thank you.
really kind of loved about it was your sort of the point of view, and also so I feel like this sort of authentic sort of cinema, and especially in trans narratives, I think it's something that like people are always striving for. Tell me a little bit about sort of the process you came into when you were sort of sitting down and planning this sort of this film, because it's really kind of wonderful and there's a lot in there that you kind of like kind of go for. So
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it was just a lot of like thought experiments and feelings. You know, as I was transitioning, I kind of came to that phase where it kind of goes beyond like the physical transitioning and more about like where have I come? How far have I come? What's my goal points? Like, how do I define myself as a woman? And like, what does motherhood mean to me? What are like the lines that I feel like, if crossed for me, would challenge me? And I think a lot of those like thoughts and feelings were kind of rolling around in my head as I was desperately trying to find something to direct that was like, you know, not like a mil five or $2 million. And especially for like a queer, like biracial filmmaker, that's like very hard to find financing for. So I think a lot of it came out of this like desire to tell a story combined with these sorts of feelings and thoughts that were going on in my mind and also my co-writer Kristen Nuno's mind as well. And then we just sat down and started writing it, and then we started developing those characters. And then we fell in love with them, and then we felt really guilty about ruining their lives because obviously, as those who've seen it, it's a challenging story, you know, for those
no, I
characters.
mean, it really is because it kind of like sort of unpacks this sort of relationship, which is funny because Chris, the our protagonist in there, calls it a friendship, but I think Naomi has other thoughts about it, which is kind of very
Mhm.
very interesting in how sort of like sometimes relationships work, and the sort of the way that they parted and the things that sort of happened around their sort of parting, and
Mhm.
then subsequently Chris's sort of journey to become herself and transition, and then kind of then that reconnection. So it's, I mean, there's so much in there that
Yeah,
is really
yeah.
interesting to me that um I don't think is really kind of discussed in a lot of sort of trans narratives. Like you kind of really dig into the bone of it, which and tell me sort of like your thoughts of like really why you kind of like went there. Because I mean, you could have made this very kind of like almost light in many ways, but you really kind of went for it, which I so appreciate.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I mean, I love digging into the meat and potatoes of stories, and it felt like I don't know, the way that we had originally constructed it, it just felt like it was kind of this like sort of grand tragedy almost for both of these characters. And um I just feel like it's really important for queer narratives, and particularly for trans narratives, to expand beyond the stories, particularly that cisgendered like directors often tell, which is about the transitioning process. And it creates this idealization and this mysticism about the experience, when in fact, like, with any hope, these feelings and experiences that these characters are going through are very universal. And even if they have the specificity of like being a trans Iranian American trans character, or like an Asian American character, that like there still are these like, you know, the feelings of regret or like the loss of like what this is. Or like, it was interesting that you brought up earlier about Chris's notions of friendship. And I think that's something that's like very like true in that like those of us who are trans have different relational experiences with the people that we're in the relationships with, not only romantically, but just us also as friends. And like our identification of it is so fundamentally different than those who are experiencing it from like a cisgendered even perspective, even in like the queer community, you know?
But I also think that you hit on something that's very universal too, because I know myself as a cisgendered man, like I sort of sometimes will categorize different relationships and different sort of like experiences with people in certain boxes, and I found that sort of like thread in the film was very sort of very universal. Which like again, it's stuff, it's sort of topics that like I really wish more people would kind of unpack, because it does
Mhm.
sort of like, I don't want to say normalize because I don't believe in a normal
Sure,
anything,
sure. Right,
uh,
right, right.
but I feel like again this sort of like um sort of thread that is very universal that you can kind of see, even if that experience isn't necessarily yours, which is kind of, you do so effectively in this film.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
um Tell me a little bit about like how exactly was the film sort of like from beginning to end, because I know it does, I've did a little reading on sort of your sort of concept of coming to it, and sort of getting the film off the ground. How really much of your own sort of like authentic sort of story, your story kind of wove itself into
Yeah.
then.
I think that both characters carry aspects of me. I think I could say that for Kristen too. I mean, I think that Chris definitely has like my, you know, body dysmorphia sort of insecurities. Obviously, like our costume designer echoed like Chris's outfit based off of me. And when we sat like stood next to each other, I was like, okay, I see what you're doing there. That's, yep, that makes sense.
Twins.
Um, yeah, and that first monologue that she gives in the restaurant, that was almost verbatim sort of what I had written in my coming out letter. So a lot of that stuff, particularly on set, that was like very like challenging because it was just a lot of like dredging up sort of those emotions of first coming out and transitioning, which yeah, I hadn't thought about in years. I mean, I had thought about, of course, but like I hadn't emotionally processed for a number of years. So all that stuff, you know, I mean, one of the things that I always talk about is like this film was a big part of like art therapy for me, of like working out sort of those experiences and those issues. And when it comes to Naomi, I think Naomi definitely like carries my stubbornness and my relentless drive and my anger, you know, when things don't, you know, a lot of that like frustration that she feels, a lot of that like pent up frustration that I felt like not being able to direct. Because, you know, like editing is great, but like when you want to direct, you just want to direct and you love it so much and you care about it so much that that relentless drive, but also being stuck in flux. I think I really connected with the character in that way. Um, the resolution of how the story ends is definitely like a construct that Kristen and I had sort of built out, but it was kind of based off of those feelings of like how would I have felt in that situation? What are those lines that I would say? Like for me, it's like not to get into spoiler territory, but there's a choice that's made that like I agree with, but in that circumstance, that would be hard for me to process. And I was like, what are those like things that sort of delineate, you know, the choices that we make or what sides we take, you know, and with any hope at the end of the film, like people will come away with it feeling like they're both right and they're both wrong, that they both made choices that were just human, you know, with any hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you really kind of got that point across of the, and I also feel like there's a lot of sort of like that could almost, the both of them could almost be one person,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
their relationship was that sort of like kind of intense that they almost seem
Mhm.
like two sides of the coin in many ways. If we're gonna binary, if we're gonna put it into like a binary, but we
Totally. Right, right.
not
Yeah.
necessarily that we want to, but I think that like the sort of the um conversation between them was like, it was almost like a monologue in many ways,
Mhm.
which I thought was really kind of interesting because, um, I mean, I really love sort of conversational films anyways, because I feel like a lot of times they unpack, unless it's something like really kind of like
Mhm.
breezy, like a Woody Allen film, which is like super talky, but it doesn't really like to say really much.
Yeah,
And maybe,
exactly. They all say the same thing. It's
yeah,
like
exactly. I
relationships
feel
are
like
hard, and
right,
I
exactly.
have issues with women, but you know.
Everything's hard. But what I really kind of really appreciate about your sort of your storytelling is that it does, I mean, this could have been two people regardless, and I think that the um your sort of portrayal of Chris and her coming back to sort of like make peace with her past is such a universal theme. Do you have, I mean, was that sort of like something that you have thought of in your own sort of journey of like sort of making peace with sort of the past?
I think I think for there was a time where I had regret or guilt, particularly about like dating, you know, the women that I dated, and in like the guise of like trying to like, you know, be who I thought I was supposed to be for society. But you know, I mean, they've since to go on and live extremely exceptional and beautiful and wonderful lives, and in relationships, and very happily together. And so I feel like that sort of has gone away in that way. But I've also been like tremendously fortunate, and that was one of the things that we were talking about in one of the queer panels that I was on when South by was happening. Is like this, like I didn't lose that many friends when I came out. Like I lost maybe two or three, and that in itself is like exceptionally wild, because
Yeah.
oh, I mean everybody I know has lost more people than that. Um, but in that way, it's like this thing where it's like it it it's so wonderful, but it's sort of like that next step where it's like I didn't, I always had that support structure, which made everything like so much easier to accomplish and get done, and talk about and expose and discuss. And I think without that support and that community, I don't think I would have been able to like tell the story, you know, and get the stuff out here. I feel like I jumped a rail there. Sorry. So can we go back to what was the original question that you asked? I started going in this tangential direction. I was like, wait a second, I think I lost the thread there.
No, totally fine. Like I said, we're probably gonna be tangenting around, so
Yeah, that's great.
that's totally fine. Um, so I mean, one of the things I really also really kind of stood out too was the kind of resolution of the sort of the ending. And you know, don't be afraid of spoilers, because I mean,
Yeah,
this is
you're right. You're right. You're right.
ultimately going to go at
Yeah,
the end of the feature. So I guess we can be a little spoilery.
that's
Um,
true.
but I mean, I'm a big fan of performance art. You know, I love sort of that sort of physicality of performing and sort of getting that out and having the witnesses of the crowd sort of being part of that. Um, One, tell me a little bit about the sort of the process of sort of creating that sort of conceptual work, and also
Mm.
two, the what it meant to the sort of the resolution of the character.
Yeah, totally. We had a performance artist consultant who's my dear friend, Laura Salmon, who've worked on a number of projects together. I filmed her performances doing performance art, and I've also like worked with her on some experimental films and some documentary stuff. And so we went to her to really sort of consult and talk about like what the performance artist process was. Lynn didn't have as much experience with that world, so I think particularly in rehearsal, that was like a really great time to like for the two of them to sit down and sort of discuss the process and what does it mean to Laura. And I think for Lynn, she was able to glean a lot off of that conversation, sort of build into the character. Um, so in terms of the resolution for the character, I think that because she had desired to do this performance art for so long, but she kept on, it wasn't her life, as Chris said, it was her. It was like these blockades that she was putting up for herself. And for her to sort of be freed of that and finally be able to sort of put all this to rest, I think for both of them in their quiet ways, they found like that moment of like resolution in those spaces of saying like, you know, everything that happened was in the past and now it is actually settled inside of the past, and it's not a part of my present. And particularly for Naomi, I think that that ability to actually like work it out physically instead of even just fighting about it, but to actually physically perform it out, I think was her final moment of peace so far. Like, who knows if the story's going to continue, but like, as far as we know right now, the resolution's there.
Well, actually,
um
I really kind of hope that the story continues because, again, you kind of gave us a little sort of capsule and a little like sort of like a almost like a peephole into this sort of world of these two characters. And I have to say, like, I really kind of enjoyed spending time with them and wanted to know more. So I do hope that there is maybe like a future glimpse of them.
I would like there to be too. That would be pretty neat. I think it'd be great to see them again. See them again. Oh boy. But
There's a
but
sequel. The sequel's
right,
like,
exactly. Oh my gosh, we were like joking about that. We're like, see you then, and then see you again, and see you later. You could do all the see you
it's
series.
like
Oh god.
the Before Sunrise
Right, exactly.
trilogy.
Yeah, but what it going back to the performance, the actual performance of itself was interesting because we had planned out almost a completely different version of what that performance was supposed to be. And then as we were getting closer to it, our creative consultant, script supervisor, my good friend Jason Morgan, who also went to Emerson, so we met in Boston. Yeah, and we so he and our performance artist like kind of got together and started talking it out, and then it was like one of those things where like 24 hours, I think, before we were filming it, we completely sort of reset the performance and how it was going to be constructed and what it was going to be about. Which is great because I think a lot of like performance art and like art feels that way, where it's kind of like last minute explosion of like creativity, and it's like, well, what is this? And then we sort of cornered poor Lynn, and we are like, listen, like we completely rewrote the performance. It's just like, okay. And I was like, okay, you got to do all these things, and we're going to do this thing. We're going to rip it up, because initially it didn't have the ripping up. I think there were like other constructions sort of put in there, but it didn't feel as cinematic. And we wanted something that could really easily be cross-cut between the spaces, that felt physical and visual. Because we were like, this is like the end of the movie. We got to give something, because so much of the film up until that point had been discussions and conversations, and now we're finally sort of getting to the action in the last few minutes of the movie.
Yeah, but I mean, and the performance art piece definitely felt like a sort of like a good sort of punctuation to all the conversation, because it was like Naomi having a conversation with herself about the sort of the what she was sort of experiencing, and that sort of catharsis. Like, you felt that, like, what a great, I mean, brava for an act for the actress.
Oh
Because
my god,
she just really kind of like, you felt that sort of catharsis as ripping through and cutting up those clothes. And the blood was interesting as well. Like, I was like, wow, that's a really kind of cool sort of like kind of thing to throw in, because you think about like getting an abortion, and the sort of the remains that come out, and the tissue and all that kind of stuff, and sort of having a little bit of that sort of incorporation into the performance piece. It made it feel a little bit more real, which was kind of nice.
Yeah, awesome. Yes. Yeah, well, that was Laura, our performance artist consultant, has worked a lot with blood. And actually, one of our projects was an experimental short that we did called Blood Film, where we painted our own blood on film leader and then had it scanned. And then so I did this thing, and I think as that was one of those integrations sort of towards the last minute of like the process of making this, and and Jason had brought that up, and was kind of like, it was that idea of like, sort of giving not only like the analogies of abortion, but also just like the idea of physically like sort of giving yourself a piece of yourself into this portrait of this child that never came to be, and then having your kids watch it, which is pretty disturbing. But
Exactly.
Performance artists are performance artists. You
Yeah,
gotta do.
that just sort of dawned on me. Like, I was like, oh, those kids. But I mean, maybe they don't.
But that's a lot of performance artists that I've seen in Los Angeles have kids, and the kids go there. And I think it's sort of like what we had as we were constructing the story. Kristen and I sort of set aside and like wrote like about 7 pages each of like background stories for the characters, for the, you know, for Chris and Naomi, so that they can have like a little bit more backstory. And that was one of those things of Naomi being exposed to performance art very early and sort of being exposed to the world of Los Angeles like at a very young age, you know, being like 16 years old and getting in the car and then driving into the city because like what else are you gonna do, you know? And then like getting exposed to all these things in the city that you're not prepared for, you know, being a kid. And you know, and those things can shape and alter people, you know, and especially for a performance artist who's trying to naturally just absorb everything around her as much as possible and then process it, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, again, it was such a good sort of like ending point for the film, and especially after the sort of the confrontation scene, which I actually kind of want to talk about because one
Yeah.
of the other things that I really adored about your film is the lighting design in it throughout the whole film is absolutely lovely and very punctuated with the sort of the emotion and the revelations that are sort of happening in front of us in the conversation. So we have like the brightness of that restaurant where they're having dinner and the Caesar salad is being ordered and that kind of stuff. It's like nice and bright, but then you have the darkness of the bars or the outside in the parking lot and stuff like that, where a little bit more secretive kind of conversations are happening and that sort of like slightly deeper unpacking. But
Mhm.
then the main kind of like sort of like confrontation at the end, you're in this sort of candy colored plasticky sort of environment of I guess the gallery.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
but then it turns dark as the conversation gets darker, and it was so brilliant. I was watching this, I was like, that is completely brilliant. It reminded me of Bergman in many ways. And I actually had a lot of Persona sort of thrown about in my head as I was watching it. So tell me a little bit about your sort of thoughts about the lighting, and then as a second fold question, who are your influences as a filmmaker?
Totally. Well, thank you. Oh my God, that's the very high compliments. I'll have to share them with Jordan, who will very much appreciate them. That was Jordan. That was Jordan for the most part. Jordan Perot, our DP. You know, Jordan also went to Emerson. Jason, Jordan, and I were roommates, and so one of my dreams for my first film was to get all three of us working on the film together. So we actually all stayed in my apartment here while we were filming the movie together. And it was like bunking with my roommates again. And we all drove each other crazy. But Jordan and I have worked on so many projects together sort of throughout Emerson, but then post Emerson and going into like our careers and the shorts like Swim that he DP'd. We really have such a shorthand that so much of it's just like, I'll be like, well, I have like a shot list. And I'm like, I don't need to do a shot list. I already know what you want. And I was like, okay. And then that one, he and Tom Wyman, our production designer, had spent a lot of time sort of talking together about like how they could use like the Titan tubes in ways that felt like an art installation, but still being able to like work our way into it. And then throughout the prep process, that was something that we always came back to, particularly for that scene, because you know, we were like, oh, you know, it could be a little like colder in the restaurant, then it could be a little warmer in the bar, and then it gets a little colder again once we get to the backyard, and then we're really gonna just like explode the colors then. And I think it was like in our second week of filming that weekend, we were sort of sketching out like how we were gonna construct um, that sequence and the beats in which when the lighting shifts happened within that fight. I mean, it was just, I mean, and then that's the dream. And then working out with like Lynn and Puya, like what the timing is and where they should be standing and figuring out all that blocking. But Jordan just did such an amazing job. One of the things that we had talked about with the film also in regards to the lighting, but also just in regards to the camera, was shooting it in large format in 6K with like full frame lenses so that we'd be able to kind of get this like sort of what I described to Jordan as like I wanted like an epic canvas to tell this very intimate story on and to really give it this sort of large scale filmmaking effort in
Mhm,
terms of the way that it was lit, in terms of the way it was designed, and that formalism that I felt like could hopefully lend itself to some level of subversion.
mhm.
Because particularly as we were heading into like making the film, I was watching a lot of older cinema. I was watching a lot of like Marty and like a lot of like the older like you know David Lean, Brief Encounter, like those sorts of films, and like thinking about right and like thinking about like how those films were constructed and their formalism. And I was like, I think I hope that like it would be kind of neat to see this film sort of be told in this way, like My Dinner with Andre, with those films, but with, you know, these two women in minority women that you wouldn't normally see in those spaces, like having those conversations and doing those things, right? And that, you know, and that lent itself to all the things I was inspired by, you know, all those films, and Bergman definitely, of course. um I definitely like thought a lot about Columbus and Kogonada, you know, and that was another big influence for this film. And then somebody on Letterbox made a little mention of Romer, Eric Romer in there, and I was like, yes. It's like somebody got a little, it snuck in there a little bit. And even Jordan was like, I've never even seen Romer, and I was like, yeah, but I was thinking about Romer, you know. And
Well,
then I mean,
it's funny that you
yeah.
mentioned David Lean, because I was like, you and I are gonna be like fast friends. I'm like Marnie and like Brief Encounter. I was like, yes, because
Oh
now
yeah,
I'm
oh my
like,
god.
now I'm thinking more about. I'm like, a lot of your film, the conversation reminds me a lot of Brief Encounter, and also Marnie. Like Marnie is like a such a brilliant and underappreciated sort of Hitchcock film, and I know that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
totally tortured Tippi Hedren in it, but what a performance!
I
Like
know.
and
Oh
I
yeah, totally.
and Brief Encounter, if for the audience out there, if you've not seen Brief Encounter, please do yourself a favor and like watch it, because it is probably one of the best sort of heartbreaking tales of classic Hollywood cinema out there.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And yeah, I think there's also like some Kieslowski in there, you know, some Three Colors Blue in particular. That was like a big influence for me heading into the film. Before we started filming, I put together like a 3.5 hour like mega cut of like every film that had like inspired or like the visual aesthetic. And then I sort of, Jordan and I played in the background as we started discussing shots, shot structure and all that. And that made it fun. And also I was kind of ready to see a movie that, like, there's some like I think it was Straight Up that came out last year that had it too, but I feel like there's kind of this lean more towards formalism now in independent cinema, and I really appreciate that, because as much as I love handheld naturalistic Terrence Malick, I'm like, I think we can have both. Can't we have both? Can't we
Yes.
have both?
Yes. And I love that you're striving for both, because I feel like the more that as filmmakers push the sort of the boundaries a little bit and kind of define the boundaries, the better off at us as curators, audience, stuff like that are going to benefit from it. So I appreciate that sort of that push, and encourage it too.
Yes.
I'm also trying to get filmmakers to make genre films, because I'm like,
Oh yeah.
I want more genre films
I
personally.
want more. I want more queer genre films. I want more queer horror films. I want more queer. Yeah, yeah, totally.
I would love
Oh yeah.
a as much as I'm not about the police, I would love a trans cop procedural, because I think that would be just kind of
That
amazing.
would be
Like
interesting.
Law and
Yeah.
Order, but everyone's trans,
Hmm.
or James Bond, and everyone.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, that'd be awesome. That'd be so good. Oh my
Uh,
god. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's like it's you know it. I think what I was trying to say earlier when I was going on about the thing was like finding those spaces of like trying to tell like stories within the mainstream, but also films within the community, and like trying to like have both in those experiences, because as like we progress towards a place where like the community is accepted by the mainstream, I hope that we don't lose those identities and those parts that make us a part of this community that is so sort of scattered and disparate, and like, you know, it takes so many different cultures and communities and sort of nestles them into one thing. But I think that that's so beautiful, and I think that that's important to keep. And as much as like, and the only way that we could do that, I think, is to expand the narrative of where these stories are going and tell stories that are different, that don't necessarily like fit within the structures of what we've seen previously. And I think we're getting there. I
yeah,
mean, even like some of the films I saw at South by, some of the films I've seen at like Disorient, and some of the festivals coming in, it's like I feel like there's like a shift even in other communities where we're seeing like kind of this growth of like the types of stories that could be told. And I think that's really encouraging, because we need more of it. And especially now, because like with all the crazy shit that's happening even now, you know, we need we need more of these stories. I mean, I always assumed, you know, like on the crux of the story being probably more queer focused, certainly, than Asian American focused. It it's troubling that like it's now become more like our film has become more topical as a consequence of like the hate that's being driven around everywhere, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it really, I mean, it's really troubling, the sort of that, but I mean, it's also like, again, I feel like the pandemic has sort of like caused us all to sort of like now sit with ourselves and sit with all the
Hmm.
crap that's been going on for hundreds of years and sort of
Hmm.
trying to get ourselves like to a better place. And I feel
I
like,
hope so.
and it's weird because like, growing up in like sort of my when I came out, it was like the or late 80s, early 90s, and there was a lot of this sort of like um diversity, inclusion, sort of like conversations, anti-racist conversations happening then. I remember taking over university buildings at UMass to get minority representation on the faculty, and
Yeah.
it's weird, and it's weird that I have so much deja vu, but I feel what's different about now is that I feel like the culture has caught up a little bit, and that
Mm.
slightly moving. We're moving. I think the needle is moving, which is it didn't happen before because it slid all the way back.
It did. It
Uh,
did. Well, and that's the state of, you know, history. History is like a pendulum and it swings back and forth, and that's something that I've been kind of speaking a lot about in the Q&As and on panels and stuff is like, you know, there's, I think what I experienced like last time with like the Obama administration was a lot of people just being like, okay,
yep.
great, like he's in office, like we did it, like we're done. And it's like, no, but like there was that backslide that happened, and now it's like we're trying to swing back, but it's like we got to keep this thing going this way
Yep.
instead of allowing it to slide back because people are getting complacent, because people think like, oh, now we're in a position of power where we have control, everything's going to be okay. And it's like, no, we have to keep the fight going, because now is the time when people will get lazy with representation. People will get lazy in media with being like, well, you know, like we're still covering this stuff. It's still positive, right? You know, and it's like, no, like we need to keep the charge,
Keep the
you
pressure.
know?
Keep the pressure up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
completely agree. I completely agree with that, and I feel like to continue to call it out and continue to sort of like push it's funny. I always describe myself as a queer propagandist in many ways, and I want that messaging sort of there and out there, and I want the conversation to continue because it's important for us all and for the future to sort of do some healing, because it's important. It's important for us to move on, because we won't move on. We will not
Yeah.
evolve
Right.
if we don't deal with the wounds that have been so long felt by
Mhm.
a lot of our peers and our colleagues. So
Absolutely.
um
Yeah.
lighting, where else?
Lighting to politics to
Lighting
society to, you
society.
know.
So how is so this film was sort of made in the shadow of the pandemic. How did
Hmm.
the sort of like the shutdown and the lockdown sort of like kind of affect
Yeah.
sort of the production? Did you make different choices? Obviously, you kept the set safe, but
Yeah, well, we were actually able to finish filming on February 1st. So it was like right when like we were starting to hear about things happening in Wuhan, and then like I think it was the third week, a few people on the crew got sick. And then like Jason got sick and we started looking for masks. We couldn't find masks at any CVS or anywhere. And that was in January, like late January. Yeah, late January. It's crazy. And then March happened and the pandemic hit. So a few days before mid-March, when everything shut down in LA, I sat down and put together an assembly of the film to show to like our only producer, who was in LA at the time, because our other producer moved back to Nashville, and then our other producer, Matt Miller, was still filming the other movie that was Van Engel's film. And so so I showed it to Mia. It was really rough. It was like a 95-minute cut. It was like brutally long. And then she was like, okay, like, you know, I think it needs work. And I was like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then she's like, okay, cool. So like work on it for a couple weeks, and then we'll get back together and then we'll do another review session. Matt will be back in town. I was like, great, like perfect. Everyone will be back in town. We'll do a review session. It'll be super awesome. And then like 3 days later, it was like shut down. And I was like, ah, okay. So in that regard, the process was totally different for editing than it's ever been for me, because normally, especially at Vanishing Angle, there's kind of the process of review sessions. When they had their offices at Atwater Village, they had a big screening room in the back. And so we get, 20 or 30 friends, like people that we knew, people through this thing that you call Fun Lab, and collect all these people and like just constantly review our films and just do these peer review sessions. So I gotten so used to that, and I gotten so used to being in that environment of being surrounded by people. Everybody, like the producers would come in for a bit, and then the co-producers and the executive producers would fly in, and then like the lead act, like one of the leads would come in and like watch the film, give their notes on it. Didn't have any of that. It was like totally, I was alone in this process of putting this movie together, and I think for a time I felt really worried about it. And then I realized that it was the most painterly editing will ever be for me. Because I was like, I'm just sitting in my apartment for like 18 hours and I'm like, can't do anything. Everything's shut down. Can't go see a movie. I was like, da, 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 and it was great because it did lead to this sense of I was able to set my own schedule. I was able to say, okay, I don't know how I feel about this scene yet. I'm going to take 2 days off and not work on it, and then like come back and have a fresh perspective. And in addition to that, I decided like a month into the pandemic, I was like, well, this seems like it's going to go on for a while. And I was like, I'm going to be editing this movie, but I'm going to be all alone generally. So I decided to finish watching all the Oscar nominated and winning movies in like film history. So I watched something like, it was like 400 some odd movies, but it was great, but it was super punishing because they're literally the best films in American cinema. And I'm like editing my movie. I'm like, I'm a terrible filmmaker. I know nothing. I'm like watching like From Here to Eternity. I'm like, masterpiece. Oh God. But it was good. It was good encouragement because it really like knocked me down. It was like, knocking me down. And that's what you need when you're in the edit room, because I think a lot of directors come in with that overconfidence, and that overconfidence is their weakness, and that always gets them in trouble. And so there's like, there was like some of that, and so it made the process really unique. And I realized as I was coming out of it, I was like, this is probably, because of the pandemic in particular, the most personal film I'll ever make, because it's the film with the least amount of notes, the film with the least amount of obstruction is not the right word, but the least amount of outside forces coming in and giving perspective. That I was like, this is as good as it'll get in that regard. And that's really special because like most filmmakers don't experience that, even on their first film. One of the other big challenges on heading into the pandemic also was like, we were also trying to fundraise to finish raising funds for post-production for the film. And that was hard because it was like coming at that time where it was like, hey, everyone,
Right.
the world's falling apart. And people are getting murdered on the street by pieces of shit. I have this movie and I don't know how to promote it. And like, but at the same, by the same token, what was really great about WeFunder was that it is crowd investment and not crowd funding. And so when you are having people invest a minimum of $100, it is on the plan to sell the film and make them money. So it did feel easier in that way, where I feel like if it was Kickstarter or somewhere else, I'd feel really horrible about doing it during that time, just because everybody's financing's been so limited of late and everybody's struggling because the world went nuts for so many different reasons. So it was like that challenge of trying to work that out, but we were able to raise pretty much all of our investments by the end of it, and we're just so lucky and so fortunate to have so much support. But it was definitely like the craziest. And I live in Park La Brea, and that was right outside where like everything went down in Los Angeles last summer after George Floyd was murdered. And there was like explosions going off in the middle of the night. I'm desperately trying to finish like working on this film, but at the same time I'm like, everything's falling apart and nothing matters and everything's so horrible and America's terrible and why? And then like but then all that like fed into that energy to put into the film. And then I think that anger did inform the edit in some ways, which probably made the film better, as terrible as that sounds.
I encourage you to in future projects to sort of like find that sort of same space to sort of edit in, because what all that energy and all that sort of like that time spent is really, I mean, was really kind of, I don't know what the film looked like before, but the final all that sort of energy going into the final product really kind of made it sort of I mean, you've made a modern masterpiece, to be honest. I mean, no, honestly, I think that like people, once they see the film and they sit with it, because I have to say, like watching it a second time, I got
Mm,
so much more out of it than my first sort of viewing of it, and it's going to sit with me a little bit longer because it made me think about the sort of nuances of relationships, and also
mm,
the whole transition process, and also living authentically, that I didn't really, I mean, I can't say that I never thought about it before, but it definitely like brought it home a little bit more. And
mm.
I think that that's the sort of the kind of like golden sort of moment of the film.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Thank you. I hope that I hope that it affects people. I hope that it helps. I hope that, it allows people to take a walk in somebody else's shoes, for a while, and be able to see those experiences and know that those people aren't that different, and I think a lot of the work that I want to do with film revolves around that, and revolves around that universality. Um, I think that that means a lot for people to see that, especially now at a time when things are so divided, and everybody's so bent out of shape about all the right things and all the wrong things. you
No,
know,
no, it's really it's so true. All the right things and all the wrong things.
yeah.
So this is a sort of my like common ending question, and I know that you're sort of coming fresh off this sort of like, or kind of continuing on this journey with this film, but what's next for you?
Well, I got a couple scripts that I'm excited about. I have a horror movie that I'm really excited about. It'd be fun to do something that's like sharp and edgy and like intense and scary and like visceral and maybe more modern, if that's the right word for it.
Mhm.
I also have a young adult trans love story that like is set in the 80s, like late 80s, early 90s, that like I think would be really neat. It'd be pretty neat. 16 millimeter. I'm making it happen. I'm making that 16 millimeter happen. I'm gonna make Jordan's dreams come true. Eddie's gonna be so excited. Yeah, I mean, and I'm working on some shorts and stuff. I think it's like one of those things where, with any hope, this film will get out there, and I'll be able to get representation and get to those places of like, because there are these still small stories that I want to tell, but there's also like way too expensive stories that I have cooking upstairs that I think people would be pretty excited to see. Hopefully.
Well, I
Fingers
think,
crossed, knocking on wood.
yeah, I'm crossing my fingers too, sending all the energy and light that way, because I feel like you're gonna be one to watch, to be honest.
Oh, thank you.
I'm really kind of excited that this film has sort of gotten a little success, and sort of hopefully us showing it as well will kind of continue in pushing that trajectory forward, because
Yeah.
again, it's a super important story, and it's a very timely, it's needed really right now too, especially with the um especially coming off of a year of a lot of sort of representational documentaries, and sort of like the
Mm,
conversation about representation in the media. I feel like the stories like this are so important to sort of be like, hey, this is a universal story. This will speak to a lot of different people. um
thank you. Thank you.
so yeah.
We're gonna make it happen. We're gonna get it out there.
Awesome. Okay, and one last question, since you mentioned horror. Who's your favorite horror director or horror film?
Ooh. Ooh. Oh God. Oh, that's hard. Gosh. I mean, like of course there's like modern, like, this Peel. And then there's, I mean, I love Romero. I really love fantastical tales, like fantasy mixed with horror.
Mhm.
Um, so I mean, of course, GDT. I mean, well, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
My little promotional for Criterion over here. But The Devil's Backbone, actually, I would say The Devil's Backbone is probably one of my favorites. That movie I've only seen once, but that really affected me. Like, of course, Pans is Pan's Labyrinth is insane, and so is Shape of Water. But there's something about Devil's Backbone in the way that it's haunting in this way that's almost uncomfortable,
Mm,
that I find really interesting and creepy, but also like you like you're terrified of the child with like the floating blood, but then you also kind of want to hug him because you feel bad. And that's the like the empathy that Del Toro has in his horror, I think is something that is not always focused on. And that's like the type of horror that really sticks with me. Because I think a lot of times it gets stuck within like, here's the trope, but here's the monster. And I'm like, yeah, but the monster is scarier when the monster's within. And when like the monster is like a human and it's not some sort of monster, but it's an actual like that's the terrifying in the same way Pans does it. So yeah. Oh my god, I could go on. I'm just trying to like my movie mind's like scanning through thousands of images, right? It's like, oh my god, there's so many. I love movies so much. I encourage everybody to just watch more movies. I encourage everybody to watch all the films of Wicked Queer. I encourage everybody to keep on supporting independent because that is so important, especially now, because we need to keep art going. We can't let it fall by the wayside. We got to get theaters back into place. We got to get like people's butts in seats and really make this happen because I can't live in a world where cinema is not a part of my life. That would be insane and I would hate it. So can't let
I
it happen.
I completely agree with it. More butts and seats, but for now,
Yes.
we're coming to you in your living room or your bedroom. All the features for Wicked Queer are running April 8th to the 18th. We're also doing all of our shorts programs. We have 17 shorts programs that run from the 1st of April to the 30th. If you want more information about the programming, go to www.wickedqueer.org. Mari, it was a delight to sit down with you. I'm so glad that we did this, and I want to talk to you forever and ever and ever. So,
Yes, yes,
um,
always. Definitely.
so thank you again for being part of this and being part of Wicked Queer's 37th edition. And I wish you
Thank you.
so much success on this film.
Thank you. I thank you for having us. It's been awesome.